All right, ladies and gentlemen, my name's Dan Hughes. I'm going to be walking you through this demonstration today. If you have any questions at all about Color Efex, about Silver Effects, about any of the Nik plugins, or if there's anything else I can even help you with, um, feel free to type your questions into the questions box. If it's not something that I can answer right away, maybe it's not specific to what we're talking about, I might hold it until after the presentation portion of the webinar, which should last about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll dive into a Q&A after our demonstration portion of the webinar. Actually, as we begin here, I've got Photoshop launched. I've got the first image kind of ready and on screen. Um, it, just out of curiosity, would you say that you are new to Color Efex Pro? You are pretty experienced, or you're an expert with Color Efex Pro? And again, if you don't mind just typing into the questions box to let me know, that would be really helpful. And it just helps me kind of gauge exactly what I'm going to say, or at least how I'm going to say it. So, because if we've got a bunch of experts in here, I don't need to cover certain things. Whereas if there are folks who are newer, I want to make sure to cover the interface and so on. All right, so it looks as though as people are typing in, we've got kind of a wide gamut from folks who are pretty comfortable to folks who are brand new to the software. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about Color Efex Pro 4 and the filters within Color Efex Pro 4. I'm not going to deviate much from that, although I have a trick or two that I might show you when using the Nik plugins from Photoshop. To begin with, I am going to launch the software from Photoshop here. We're going to use the Nik selective tool. The software plugs into Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Lightroom, as well as DxO's PhotoLab 2. In fact, if you purchase the software now, you get a copy of PhotoLab 2 Essentials with the Nik Collection. And that's a really wonderful way of processing your raw files. It's got some really cool capabilities, and we've got control points built directly into PhotoLab 2. But for now and today, we're going to be launching the software from Photoshop. Again, if you have questions, feel free to type them in. Basically, the software works the same way whether you launch from Photoshop, Lightroom, or PhotoLabs 2. The difference would be the kind of infrastructure you have afterwards. Meaning, like in Photoshop, we're going to be dealing with layers, and therefore you have access to layer masks, blending modes, smart objects, these kinds of things. Whereas launching from Lightroom, you don't have that kind of capability. And then launching from PhotoLab is a little bit different than that. The software itself works exactly the same way. And to launch the software from Photoshop, you'd either use this palette here, the Nik selective tool, or you'd go up to the filter drop-down menu, down to the Nik collection, and then click onto the Nik plugin that you want to open the software into, whether it's analog or Color Efex or so on and so forth. So let's launch Color Efex Pro 4. The plugin here has 55 individual filters. Oh, it actually opened into the one that I wanted to show you, I want to use. I'm going to actually close the detail extractor for just a second by clicking the little X button that's to the right of the label in the filter stack on the right side of the interface. Now, Color Efex Pro 4 is 55 individual filters. I break them into two different kinds of filters. You have creative filters and you have corrective filters. The corrective filters are kind of designed to fix stuff, fix photographic problems that you might have. And actually, there's a good amount of crossover because something like detail extractor could be used for creative purposes, or it could be used for corrective purposes. In this case, and in sort of, if we were to take sort of like a, if you will, professional direction in this, I'll kind of focus on the more corrective tools to fix photographs. And then towards the end of the webinar, we'll look at a few more of the creative filters. The thing is all 55 of the filters have professional usage. So it's hard for me to just select, a few of them to get to talk to you guys about over a webinar like this. Now, the interface is launched. You're probably familiar with the software at this point in terms of looking at the interface like this. What I want to do is go and click on the filter that I want to utilize. So I'll move to the filter library on the left side of the interface, and I'm going to click on the detail extractor filter. This is an exceedingly powerful filter. It allows you to lighten up shadows, so extract the details out of shadows, or as you can see here, we've got this white water, right? We've got a kayaker going down this series of waterfalls here, and we've got this white water, and actually the detail extractor filter allows us to pull the texture in the detail out of those very bright highlights. So it's great for fountains in a background, or fountains in a in a photograph if that's the subject matter, or white water, or very bright highlights, let's say in a wedding dress, if you expose in a high contrast situation, high contrast lighting situation, and you need to be able to pull detail back in, this detail extractor filter does a great job of doing that. In fact, if you follow my cursor into the upper left corner, I'm going to click on the split preview here. On the left side of the split preview, you see the original image, and on the right side of this little red line, you're going to see the filter applied version of the image. You can actually click on this split preview and drag it back and forth, and it's going to basically allow you to see the before, and as I slide it back, the after. Now, this is a really powerful filter, again, for both creative purposes and corrective purposes. You can see all of the texture and detail that we're basically extracting or bringing out. Now, the thing about any of these filters is that if you have details that are completely black without detail or texture, and you have highlights that are completely blown out, there isn't a whole lot that it can do. You got to have something in at least one of the RGB channels to be able to get that detail back. And actually, I'm seeing in the bottom portion of this image here, the detail extractor can't get any of this detail back because it's completely blown out. Now, I know this for two reasons. First of all, as I look at this and slide the slider back and forth, the split preview, there's no texture that we're able to bring out. And then also, if you follow my cursor into the lower right corner, Color Efex Pro 4 has a histogram, and then it also has a loop function. We'll talk about the loop function later in the webinar. For now, let's take a look at the histogram, which is a live histogram. As you make adjustments to your image using these filters, you'll actually watch the histogram shift and change. And if you notice on the right side of the histogram, some of these highlights are completely blown out. It's pushed all the way against the right side of the histogram. And actually, to really get a feel for that, there's a clipping mask. And in the upper right corner of that histogram, and then in the upper left corner of the histogram, you have a shadow and you have a highlight clipping indicator. And so now that I've clicked on the indicator, I've kind of locked it on, and I'm seeing that those highlights are totally blown out. And there isn't too much that I can do about that. I might be able to, and I want to talk more about this later on, in some of the filters, like detail extractor, there's actually a highlight extractor filter or highlight slider. It's not doing us any good here. I'll show you an image where we can actually kind of preserve some of the highlight detail because it's not completely blown out using the highlight slider. And we'll talk about the shadow slider as well. Now, where was I? So I want to explain this filter, show you the histogram. Oh, and I wanted to talk to you about the presets that are built into each filter. So there are things called recipes in Color Efex Pro, which are combinations of multiple filters. And then there are filter, sorry, pardon. There are filter variations or preset variations that are kind of built into the software as well. Right now, the sliders on the right side, these are the controls of this individual slider, and we're at the default settings. But if you follow my cursor to the left side of the interface, and I don't want to spend too much time doing this, but every single filter has a little filter stack that's to the right of the filter label itself in the left side of the interface. If you click on that little filter stack, it opens into a different set of variations of applying this particular filter on the image. So here's a large details kind of preset. Here's a flat and detailed preset. This is where we're pulling a lot of texture and detail out of the image. This is where you've got more of a creative aspect or a creative look to the image, as opposed to at the default settings, we're basically just trying to retain highlight detail and texture. Now, every filter has these filter variations. right? Obviously, they're going to be different because the detail extractor filter does something very different than the darken, lighten, center filter. But every one of the filters are going to have those kinds of variations. And this is a really nice thing to know because it's kind of hidden away in the filter library there, and it's a nice little sort of add-on, a nice little way of controlling the image. I'm going to turn off the histogram highlight clipping. And then the next thing that I want to do is I basically just want to apply this detail extractor into the highlight areas of our water. And right now, the filter is being applied to the entire image. So what we're going to do to selectively put this filter into just the water is we're going to use control points. These control points allow us to either add the filter in a particular area or remove the effect from a particular area. These control points also make selections for you almost completely automatically. All you have to do is point at the object and place a control point on that object. So in this case, I only want the effect on the water. So I've clicked on the plus control point on the right side of the interface, and I'm just going to go ahead and place a point on the object where I want to put the effect. What the point is supposed to do is look for the similar tones, colors, and textures that you've placed the point on. And since this is a plus control point, it's putting the effect in on the water. If I were to take a minus control point from the right side of the interface and place it, let's say, on the rocks over here, that's going to remove the effect from those rocks. Now, I don't think we even needed to do that because I think that this plus control point is going to do a pretty good job of finding and selecting the water and putting the effect in where we want it to be and not putting the effect where we don't want it to be. To kind of confirm that or to verify, if you move over to the right side of the interface into your filter stack and into the filter controls in this case, click on the words control points. This is going to open up into a control points list. Right now we only have one control point, so we're only going to have one listed out. We'll see as that expands as we'll add more control points and other filters on other images. But if I want to see where the control point is selecting and putting this effect in, I move to the far right side of that control point list and click on the little hide selection, show hide selection of control points. So this little empty box here might be hard to see in the webinar. If I check that on, I'm able to view where the control point is putting the effect in and where it's not. And what you're seeing right now is you're seeing a selection. It's a visualization of the selection that the control point is making. Anything that's white has the effect. Anything that's black does not have the effect. And then anything that is gray has some of this detail extractor or filter applied to it. In this case, it's a detail extractor. So the plus control point puts the effect in, makes that selective visualization white. And if I take a minus control point, maybe place it in the upper left corner here, you can actually see is that's going to be removing the selection, removing the detail extractor. The other thing that you're seeing here is I've actually left the histogram shadow indicator on. I'm going to turn that off. But you're seeing a much cleaner selection now. In fact, as I take a minus control point and maybe place it in the lower right corner, I can go and clean up that portion of the selection as well. And I can just go and place points, however many points I might want, into the areas where I want the effect with plus control points. And I can put minus control points in any of the areas where we don't want the effects. Now, the thing to think about is that these control points make a selection that's very different than a standard selection that you might make using like an edge detection brush in Lightroom or a lasso tool in Photoshop or quick select or anything like that. These control points are going to attempt to make a photographic looking selection. So the effect that we're putting in should kind of reflect a photographic effect. Meaning even if the control point, this plus control point, is affecting the rocks over here, it might do it in a way it's not like an abrupt edge, like a very deviated line. It might just add a little bit of the effect in, and usually those kinds of spillover or that kind of effect looks pretty good. It usually actually helps to have some of that. If I click this filter on and off using the checkbox that's to the left of the label in the filter, I can actually see what the filter's doing. So there's the before, there's the after. I'm really liking the effect basically at the default settings when just placing control points on the areas where we want the effect and minus control points where we don't want the effect. So really quickly, This is just using one filter. We've talked a lot about the interface already in the first 15 minutes of the webinar. Here's the before, here's the after. There's all sorts of other things that we could do to this image, but oftentimes we only need to do one thing, right? Or two things. We only need to use one or two filters, or we only need to extract a little bit of detail from here or there and make a really subtle effect. So I'm going to kind of stick with that kind of workflow for this image. We're going to say that we're all done using just this detail extractor filter. I'm going to click the OK button that's in the lower right corner of the Color Efex interface, and that's going to bring us back over into our host software, in this case Photoshop. And in Photoshop, our original background is going to be duplicated. The effect is added to that duplicated background, and then we're basically working in a non-destructive process because we could always go back to the original background if we wanted to or needed to. And or since this is a whole other layer of pixels, there's all sorts of stuff that you could work with in Photoshop, like if you did want to use a layer mask in combination with your control points, or you want to change a blending mode or anything like that. Now, before we move on to the next image, I'm just going to take a look at the GoToWebinar control panel, make sure that there are no questions or there's nothing sort of popping up and there are no problems. Looks like we're all good to go still. So I'll minimize that. Let's close out the kayaker. And then let's actually move into this old cowboy image. So launching into Color Efex Pro, we did that a minute ago using the filter drop-down menu in Photoshop. You can always use the Nik selective tool. One quick thing, if the Nik selective tool doesn't come up when you launch Photoshop, it should just automatically come up if you've turned on that setting. Where you can find it, so I'm going to close the selective tool. Where you can find it in Photoshop is you'll go up to the File drop-down menu, go down to the Automate option, and then in the Automate sort of prompt, you're going to go to the Nik selective tool, or Nik Collection selective tool as it's called here. So as I click on that, this floating dialog box, the menu box, opens up, and we have access to the different Nik plugins. Now with Color Efex, you also have access to any of your favorited filters. So I can just click on Color Efex, and if I click on this button here, sorry, if I click on that button there, it's going to launch into the first filter that I used in the last stack of filters. So it would go into the detail extractor filter if I click into Color Efex Pro 4 now. But I also have all of these filters favorited. These are filters that I use quite often. And then you also have the ability to launch directly into recipes. I haven't actually added any of the recipes into my favorites list. I'll show you how to do that on this image. But basically, any of your favorited filters or favorited recipes are going to be added into this Nik selective tool for quick and easy access. So for now, let's click on cross-processing. What the heck, right? As we click on cross-processing, the software will just launch directly into that particular filter. And this is handy because where I use, probably 10 to 20 of these filters relatively often, you could favorite all of those if you wanted to. A lot of folks maybe only use 8 to 10 of these filters more often than not. So you might only favorite the ones that you use the very most in your own workflow. And to do that, while you're in the Color Efex Pro 4 interface, you'll actually see there's a little star that's to the left of each one of these filters in the filter library on the left-hand side. If you click on that star, that favorites that filter, and then it's going to show up actually in two places. It'll show up in your Nik selective tool, and then it will also show up in the sort of filter breakdowns based upon the upper left-hand interface here. So these are different kinds of filters for landscape photography. I should say it this way. These are suggested filters for landscape photography, because what you might find is that there are filters in the wedding section here that you use for wedding photography, but maybe there are a few other filters that you would use for maybe your wedding business and that aren't in this section here. But these are good suggestions for these different kinds of photography. And in the favorites section, you're going to see any of the favorited filters that I've added to my list. And you can do the same thing. So it's just a quick and easy way of accessing the software. Now, Right now we're in the filter library, as you can see, and that's the listing of all 55 of the individual filters built into Color Efex Pro. If you follow my cursor into the bottom portion of the interface, we also have a section called recipes, and recipes are groupings of filters. So I'm actually going to click back. You can create your own recipes, and actually Joseph Lenashke is going to be having a webinar about that in the relatively near future. Actually, we could take a look at the webinar schedule again to figure out when that is. I'll very quickly show you how to create recipes. He's going to talk about why you might do certain things the way you do it. But anyways, you have a series of recipes that are built into the software. They're the sample recipes, and then you also have this collection of en vogue recipes, which is a collection that I helped create in December of last year, and then was launched into the newest version of the Nik Collection. So I'm super proud of these, and these are basically filter combinations that I use pretty often. So the Red Rocks recipe, if I click on that, what's going to happen is we're going to get a little warning saying adding this recipe is going to replace any filters that are being applied to your filter stack. So I'm going to say yes, and then watch what happens on the right side of the interface. Now we have the detail extractor, cross-processing, cross-balance, photo stylizer, and darken, lighten, center applied to the image. If we take a quick look at the before and after using the compare button, there's the before, there's the after, and you might find that this is absolutely perfect and you love this look and this effect and you're done. Or you might find when you click on a recipe that you want to go into these different filters and adjust them however you might see fit. Maybe you prefer the L03 cross-processing filter on this image, and maybe in the photo stylizer, we need to increase the strength of the veritone filter that's being applied. So basically, these recipes are groupings of filters. The combinations are the ones that are built in are sample recipes, and then this collection called En Vogue. And then probably where you're going to go with this is you're going to create your own recipes after you create a look or a feel that you really like for some of your photos. And the beauty of that is that you can consistently apply the same filters, and you can go in and adapt them and change them as you see fit for each individual picture. So I've clicked on HDR like. Let's go actually into the Super Punch filter, or recipe rather. The Super Punch recipe uses bleach bypass contrast only in the Pro contrast filter. So that's actually a common combination of filters that I'll use. These recipes are highly transformative for the most part, meaning they're going to kind of stylize the image, and it's a pretty strong application, right? If you look at that before and after, it's transforming the image quite a bit. So that'll work on a lot of photographs, but in other images, you're going to need to dial back the effect, or you're going to need to sort of massage and correct the adjustments so that it fits the application that you want. We'll do that in a second. The first thing that you're going to do, or the first thing that we're going to look at here, because I almost forgot to do it, is how you favorite a recipe. And it's the same way that you'd favorite a filter in the filter list. You just click on the little star that's to the left of the label, and then what's going to happen is that recipe is going to show up in the Nik Selective tool. And so it's an even faster way to kind of dial in your workflow, meaning, you know, time is money. You want to work quickly. You might as well save your recipes if you've got a collection of filters that you really like and that you want to be able to apply over and over and over again. Basically, if you're going to do something more than twice, just create a preset for it, or just create a recipe for it, and it's going to speed along your workflow. Now, I personally have fun playing with these filters and adjusting images in different ways, but a lot of times folks just want to get a particular look out of their image and then get back out shooting, because that might be what you're more interested in. What I've found is I like massaging these images, and I like kind of playing around and figuring out what these different filters are doing, which is probably why I've been given the opportunity to teach everyone about how to do this stuff, because I enjoy doing it. Anyways, going into the bleach bypass filter, this is one of the most highly transformative filters in this stack, and I don't want it to be such a strong application. So what we're going to do is go into the bleach bypass filter. I've actually already clicked on the control points dialog, which launches into a control points list, as we saw in the last image. we don't have any control points on this filter, so you don't see any listed out, but you do have an opacity slider available. And what the opacity slider is going to allow us to do in this case is kind of just dial in the overall effect of what this bleach bypass filter is doing. And in this case, I want to dial this down to maybe 30% so that it's not nearly as transformative as it was, but we're still getting a little bit of that local contrast and a little punch of contrast as well. In fact, let's bring that up to 40%. Let's zoom in a couple times. I'm going to use the Command plus shortcut to zoom in. You can use Command minus to zoom out. Or if you just click on the zoom prompt, it'll actually zoom you in to whatever the zoom percentage is set to. To change the zoom percentage, you actually click on this little drop down or the pop-up menu here, and you're able to zoom into different levels. So we'll go in 1:1 here, and we can adjust the navigator. I want to show you what this bleach bypass filter is doing. So here is the before, and give it a second. There's the after. So basically, we're just bringing out a whole lot of texture in the image, and in this case, it's a different looking texture than that bleach bypass filter that we were using. Now, watch what happens if I reset this filter back to its original default setting. So to do that, if you move to the right, there's the little X key or X button that's going to get rid of this filter. And then there's a little stack here. There's 3 lines and a little drop down or pop up. If you click on that, you can actually reset individual filters. And as I do this, the bleach bypass filter is set back to its default settings. So this is a highly transformative filter. It's highly stylized. It does a really great job at what it's supposed to be doing, but sometimes it's too strong of an effect. And in this case, I'd say it's way too strong of an effect. I just want to get a little bit of this effect out of it. So I'm going to move into my brightness and saturation and contrast sliders, and I'm going to start to dial them back. So the contrast, I'm going to set to 20, which is the minimum for this particular filter, and then move into local contrast, dial that back a little bit as well. And then, of course, we can control the opacity of the filter to do whatever we need it to do. Now, again, the opacity, just because I want to reiterate this, the opacity slider for every single filter, you're going to find that by clicking into the control points section here. Every filter has that. As we look at the contrast only filter, if I move into the control point section, you can see the opacity slider there as well. Now, I love what's happening on this image, but I want to control the color a little bit. So we're going to click the Add Filter button on the right side of the interface, and this is how you add a filter to your stack of filters. You click Add Filter, you move over into the filter list, which is automatically populated, and we're going to use brilliance and warmth. Actually, we're going to use brilliance and warmth twice on this one image. We're just going to do it selectively, and we're going to apply a warm sort of coloration to the subject, and we're going to cool down the background a little bit with a second application of brilliance and warmth. And this should help us to create a little bit more depth using kind of a color contrast technique. So the brilliance and warmth filter has just 3 sliders. It's a really straightforward filter to use. You can control the saturation, and that's basically like the volume of the color. You can control the warmth of the color, so you can warm or cool the image. That's kind of what we're going to be using today, or at least on this application. I'm going to warm the subject. I'm actually going to take it too far. I'm going to make it pretty strong, at least at first. So we'll warm it up. And then we'll use a little bit of perceptual saturation, which this slider is a proprietary tool that's only built into the Nik plugins, and it's basically a different kind of saturation increase as we slide the perceptual saturation slider to the right. What it wants to do is take the coloration that it sees in different pixels, so as I slide this all the way to the right, and increase the pixels that are not as saturated. as maybe some of the others. And so what this is going to do in this case is it's going to really increase the saturation in his skin, which was a little bit desaturated because of the bleach bypass. You can see the warming effect here. And then you can see because the shadow side was a little bit cooler, sort of inherently in the capture, you can see that is being increased as well. Now, we're not going to leave perceptual saturation at its maximum at 60%, but I just wanted to show you what that's going to do so that you have a good feel for what this slider is doing. And in fact, it's not going to ever hurt your image for you to slide that slider all the way to the right and all the way to the left, just to see what any slider it might be doing in the application of the image. And so what you can do is see if it's a desired effect. Now, I like what we've got here, but I want this brilliance and warmth to really only be affecting him. So I'm going to take plus control points and I'm going to place them on him and size the area of influence, the circle that's going around the control point, to basically only select and to only affect him. Now, there is a circle that's going around that control point, and that's going to be the area that is going to be affected. But it's not going to be the stuff that's going to be affected necessarily, right? Meaning we're not making a circular selection with the control point. We're making a selection inside of the circle of the object that we've placed the point on. If I place this plus control point on some of the geez, I can't remember the name of the rock there that's in on his shirt. Man, that's sort of silly. They're so common. If I place my plus control point on the blue of his shirt or on his, is it a bowler tie there? Nice with an eagle. It's a beautiful tie. Basically, the control point is only going to be affecting the blue tone, color, and texture that we place the point on, even though the circle encompasses a lot of this other area. So what I want to do, though, is not necessarily affect the blue. I want to basically place this warming effect on him, and I'm going to do that by placing those plus control points basically directly on him. Now, here are a few shortcuts or tricks using control points. You size the area of influence so that you're affecting the area that you want. And in this case, that control point isn't completely encompassing him. So I'm going to take another plus control point by duplicating this one, and I'm going to place it down here. And then I'm going to place another one over here. And the way that I'm duplicating this control point is I'm holding the Option key down on my keyboard. It's Option on a Mac or Alt if you're on a PC. While you hold down Alt or Option, click on the control point and drag your duplicate away. So it's as simple as holding Alt or Option and then clicking on a control point that you want to duplicate. If you've duplicated too many control points, or if you ever just want to delete a control point, you have to click on it so that it's active, and then just hit the delete key on your keyboard and it'll get rid of that particular control point. Now, if we move into the control points list and we look at where the effect is going to be affecting the image, I can see that a lot of the image is being affected that I don't want. Again, what you're looking at is a visual representation of what these control points are affecting. Anything that's white has the effect on it. Anything that's black doesn't have the effect on it. And what I want to do is place control points on the sections and on the objects where I do not want the effect, right? So I'm just going to take a couple large plus control points, place them on the background, and that's basically going to clean the selection up for me. And you can see we're making this really photographic looking selection. So even if the effect is, even if the control of the control points is affecting some areas that maybe we're not sure we want them to, it's going to do a pretty good job selecting out and creating this clean effect for us. You know, we could spend time kind of honing in the selections with the control points, but at this point, I'm kind of just warming him up and cooling down the background. I'm okay if there's a little bit of that spill, and I'm okay if, you know, some of the effect is going in areas that I don't necessarily want. If I'm ever not okay with that because I need a very precise selection, I'm just going to keep adding control points, plus control points where I want the effect, minus control points where we don't want the effect. Now, I like what this brilliance and warmth is doing. I'm happy with the control points. I'm going to click the Add Filter button. It's going to kind of button up that brilliance and warmth filter. And I'm going to add another application of brilliance and warmth. Now you could add, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 different applications of the same filter if you wanted to. you might just do that very selectively using control points, because you might have different sort of organizations of sliders where you want your different colors to be affecting. Now, I say that because some folks maybe would never experiment with just adding another layer of brilliance and warmth. And in this case, it does do a really nice job to create this kind of color contrast where we warm the subject, we cool the background. I'm using huge plus control points. Let's actually really cool that background down. And then I'm just going to take a minus control point and place it in the areas where I know I really don't want the effect. And what we're going to take a look at is to make sure that we're getting the effect where we want it to be, and we're getting the effect that we want out of this combination of filters. Actually, I like this color combination. We may have taken it a little bit too far, but let's click the compare button and see. So here's the original capture. It's nice. It's kind of linear. It's a little bit flat. There isn't a lot of deviation from the subject to the background because the subject is pretty close to the background, though the control of depth of field is nice. Here's the before. Here's the after. I think that the application of the color is a little bit too strong, so I'm just going to dial that back down. I kind of did that for demonstration purposes so that we could kind of see a dramatic difference. In this case, I just want it to be relatively subtle between those colors. I'm happy with the Super Pop preset or recipe that we used, and then adding the brilliance and warmth filters. So once I'm happy with that, I click that OK button in the lower right corner. Brings us back over into our host software, and we can continue to work. All right, so let me check the GoToWebinar control panel. No questions have come in, sounds good. And we will continue forward for the next 10 or 15 minutes here. So again, if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the questions box. We're going to tackle this image, and I'm going to minimize my GoToWebinar control panel. I should point out the fact that all of these photos were shot raw originally, and we've brought them into Photoshop. And in this case, we're dealing with 16-bit per channel files. If you can do this kind of post-processing with a 16-bit per channel file, I'm going to recommend that, because we're kind of changing the pixels quite a bit, and an 8-bit per channel file has far less information than a 16-bit per channel file. And the benefit of this 16-bit per channel file is that we can kind of massage and adjust the image more dramatically, or maybe not even that dramatically, and get better quality results out of the effects by simply dealing with a 16-bit per channel file. Now, by default, if you're using Lightroom and the Nik Collection, it should just automatically create a 16-bit per channel TIFF file for you. In Photoshop, when you're dealing with RAW files, you have to just make sure in the Adobe Camera Raw prompt that you open these images as 16-bit per channel files. Even if you end up saving them as JPEGs at 8-bit, because that's what JPEGs are going to save as, or even a TIFF at 8-bit, you're best off augmenting and changing these pixels at a 16-bit per channel file. They're much bigger files for sure, but you're going to get better quality results out of it. So I'll get off my soapbox. But anyways, this image has some post-processing done to it. This is a photograph of a friend of mine in Thermal in Southern California, and I was attempting to photograph, equine photography, which is a huge challenge. I thought this was pretty successful, although I imagine if I show it to an equine photographer, they'd tell me all the things that were wrong with it. But anyways, I have quite a few pixel movements, right? So there are some extraneous things in the image. I've gotten rid of those things, like this jump in the background, these extra flowers that are on the ground, the power lines in the background. I've gone and cloned all that stuff out before going into the Nik Collection. So I just get rid of it, and then I don't have to worry about it as I move into the Nik Collection. So let's launch into the software. And in this case, I want to show you the Pro Contrast filter. We're going to discuss the highlights and shadows sliders, making sure that the histogram is open, and then two other filters that'll kind of just help direct the viewer's attention into the center of the image, towards our subject. So towards Sarah and Vivace here. Now, moving into the lower right corner, you can see that we're in the loop function, and what the loop function does is it follows my cursor around, and it basically allows us to see what's happening, zoomed into 100% wherever my cursor lands. Above the hit loop and histogram, there's a little pin. It's a little push pin little icon. And what this allows us to do is lock the loop in a particular area. So if there's an area of interest that's super important that I want to make sure I'm keeping an eye on, I can click on that icon. My cursor actually turns into a little push pin, and then we can go to that area of interest, and we can kind of click and drop the loop tool so that it's locked in place. So no matter where I move my cursor, it's going to stay locked there. So that's just a nice little feature that might be helpful in different kinds of post-processing and different images. For now, though, I actually want to work with a histogram, and I want to be able to see exactly what our filter is doing to the image. Right now, and in the original capture, I have all of my shadow detail and I've got all of my highlight detail. If I go into some of these contrast control filters, I can very easily blow out highlight details and block up shadow details, clip them. And we oftentimes don't want that. So I'm going to show you two different techniques for kind of preserving those details and textures. So I've clicked on Pro Contrast. I'm going to move into the Pro Contrast sliders. This is another simple filter to use. It just has 3 sliders, and this is a corrective filter, as you can see. It attempts to correct the color cast, if you have a color cast in the image. It attempts to correct contrast, and as I slide that correct contrast slider up, you can see what it's doing to the histogram. I'm really blowing out some of the highlight details, and I'm really blocking up some of the shadow details. I might not want that, so here are 2 options. Again, I'm not going to leave this filter applying 100% correct contrast, but just to show you what these 2 options are doing, if I've blown out highlight detail using a filter, I can take this highlight slider and I can slide it to the right, and what that's going to do is start to dumb down or compress those highlights. So if I take the highlight slider all the way to 100%, now you can see in the histogram down here, I don't have any details in the histogram that are being blown out by this filter. So you can place that anywhere from 0, which I have no application of that highlights, sort of highlight preservation, or I can start to really dial this in, watching my histogram to make sure that I'm preserving highlight detail, but I'm still yielding the contrast that I'm interested in getting out of the image. So this is one option, that is using the shadows and the highlights sliders. The other option is to selectively put the effect in or take the effect out of areas where you don't want it, or you don't want all of it, right? Because oftentimes you might want a really strong application of a filter on a lot of the photo, but maybe you don't want any of it in the shadows of your horse that's jumping over this jump, or in an area of interest where you want to be able to preserve that shadow detail. I'm going to take a minus control point, and I'm going to place that on the object or the subject matter that I want to preserve the detail in. In fact, if you move the control point around, you can see in real time exactly what's going on here. So this is another reason why it might be a good idea to zoom in from time to time and just really get an idea of where the filter is being applied and where it's not. As I place this control point on the rider's face here, if I want some of the effect, I can always take the opacity slider of the control point and I can add it in however I see fit. So maybe I want 40% of the filter applied in that area. Or if we move into this area, the little flower arrangement here is a little bit blown out in the base, and actually because of the added contrast, the yellow is looking a little bit funky. So if I take a minus control point and place it on the base, it's again going to remove the entire effect out of that object that we placed the point on. If I want any of the effect, I'm going to have to take the opacity slider, and we're going to have to put that in or take it out. In this case, let's not use any on the base. Let's take a minus control point and place it in the flowers. We get that detail back. You see it's a little less funky now with the application of that filter so strong. those highlight details just really started to blow out. And we didn't need it because there's already nice kind of deviation, contrast, and tone in the lilies next to the jump. So I'm going to use the navigator to move over into this portion of the image. I'm going to place a minus control point on that base, size the area of influence so that I'm basically only encompassing the base. Take another minus control point, place that in the flowers, get that detail back. And so now, and again, I think it's too strong of an application, but now we're preserving the highlight detail, and then we're really transforming the image with this contrast. So again, we could continue with minus control points, or I think what we're going to end up doing here is I've placed that correct contrast slider at 100%. I think it's way too much for this image, so I'm going to dial that back. I think I'm going to put it at about 50 or 60%. We're still getting this really wonderful contrast adjustment. We're getting this depth out of the image because of it, but we're able to control very selectively and very precisely using those control points. In fact, let's look at a side-by-side preview this time. I'm going to tap the Tab button on my keyboard. That's going to hide the left and right prompts, the left and right menus. If I click on the side-by-side preview and we look at the image, if you kind of lean back in your chair and you look at both of the images at one time, I'm imagining that your eye is going to be attracted to the right side because there is substantially more contrast in the image. And it might still be too much. You know, you're looking at a screen and I'm looking at a screen, and these screens are not exactly the same. And also it is kind of a strong application of the filter, but your eye is going to be attracted to that higher contrast image for sure. And in this case, I think it's a nice application. The next steps, though, are to sort of direct the viewer's attention, your attention as the viewer, towards our subject. So we're going to click the Add Filter button. That's going to button up our Pro Contrast filter. I'm going to add the Graduated Neutral Density filter. So that goes into the G section. I don't think I even mentioned the fact that these filters are listed out alphabetically on the left side of the interface, but they are, so they're relatively easy to find. I'm going to click on Graduated Neutral Density. The initial preset or the initial settings for the Graduated Neutral Density are going to attempt to darken down the top of the image, because that's a very common application of Graduated Neutral Density. In this case, though, I don't want to darken the sky. I'm going to kind of leave the sky where it is with this filter, and I want to create a little bottom darkened edge. We're going to burn the edge down a little bit. So we're going to take the lower tonality slider. I'm actually going to just slide it all the way over to -100 for demonstration purposes, and then show you what the blend, vertical shift, and the rotation sliders do for this filter. The blend slider, which, by the way, you'll notice a lot of these different filters have similar names, like blend, vertical shift, and rotation. Those are going to be identical between any of the graduated filters. You're going to find those kinds of sliders within the vignette tool. You're going to find that within some of the film effects tools. And basically what they do is they allow you to just hone in the control of the image. The blend slider literally is the blending between the upper tonality and the lower tonality. The vertical shift allows us to control exactly how far up or down, right, the vertical shift of the application. In fact, if I place the vertical shift here, you can get a really good idea of what the blend slider does at 0%. There's no blend. It's this very hard application. As I bring the blend slider up, you get a much softer gradient. Right. Now, leaving the blend slider at 0, again, just so you can see what's happening, I'll slide the rotation slider around, and this way you can shift the upper tonality and the lower tonality as well. You can rotate it around anywhere you might want it to be. I kind of like the darker tone of the mountains as well. So let's look at another filter after this to be able to do that. So I want my rotation to go back to its default. I'm going to double click on that slider, and basically by double clicking on any of the sliders built into Color Efex, or basically any of the Nik plugins, it will home that slider. It'll get it back to its original default. So that's a nice way of resetting a slider if you've overdone it, or if you can't get back to 180 degrees in rotation, or for whatever reason. So let's hone this in a little bit. I want to darken down the bottom. So we're going to do a burning or burned edge of the bottom here to use sort of to use photographic vernacular. We're going to darken that edge down just a touch more. Nice. That looks pretty good, lower tonality. And again, the goal in this case is to kind of direct the viewer's attention towards the middle. And also, the other thing that we're doing by adding this or darkening down the bottom, by burning down the bottom a little bit, is we're deviating, we're changing the tones of the dirt. And why that's helpful is now it creates a little bit of a change of light, right? It creates this gradient from the edge, and that can be advantageous so that this whole area, all of the ground portion, isn't the exact same tonality. So it helps to kind of direct the viewer's attention through the image a little bit. I'm actually going to sort of weight this a little bit towards the right corner. Let's say we're happy with this effect. We click the Add Filter button, and then I want to show you the vignette filters. We're kind of coming short on time, so I'm going to go quickly through these different vignette filters. We're going to land on the darken, lighten, center filter, which kind of works like a vignette, but it also kind of works like a sleight of eye trick. It kind of tricks the viewer into not necessarily seeing a vignette, but we have the same kind of effect of a vignette. Now, we have a vignette lens filter. In the vignette lens filter, there are 3 different vignette filters. We're going to cover each one of them very quickly. The vignette lens filter is supposed to emulate a lens vignette that might occur optically when photographing something. Let's say you're shooting with a 70-200 at 2.8 to get this photograph. Oftentimes at 2.8, we're going to get a darkening of the edge, a nice little vignette. This filter is attempting to emulate that kind of effect. And obviously we can create a really subtle effect, or we can create a really dramatic effect. One of the beauties of the lens vignette filter is that you can do a light or a dark vignette. And again, it's supposed to be kind of emulating what would happen in an optical system when a lens vignetting. Okay, the other option that you have in a lot of these filters is called place center. So sometimes you want the center of your vignette or the center of your filter effect directly in the middle of the image. That's going to be the default setting. Other times you want to be able to shift that center point. To do that, you click the place center button, and then you get a little crosshair for a cursor, and you can go and shift that wherever you want it to be. Now, I don't even want to use the vignette lens filter in this case. So I'm not going to click the Add Filter button. I'm going to skip that step, and now I'm going to click Vignette Blur. And what that does is if I do not click the Add Filter button, it's going to replace the previous filter with whatever the new filter I've clicked on. And the Vignette Blur filter is going to create a blurring edge effect, right? And there are 4 different types, and there are 2 or 3 different shapes. So you can have like a squared off vignetted edge if you wanted to. And I don't think it necessarily applies to this image, excuse me, but it is a really nice filter for directing the viewer's attention through an image. And you can also, of course, just make the opacity really low, so it's a really subtle kind of effect. So it kind of creates this dreamy like blurred vignette edge. We're not using that filter in this case either, but I just want to make sure we're getting through all of these. This is the vignette filter. So the vignette filter kind of works like the lens vignette filter, except the biggest difference is that you can choose any color you want. You can use the eyedropper tool to choose a color from the image itself. So maybe I'll choose this yellow color. Now we get a yellow vignette. Or you can click on the actual color swatch in the filter, and you can actually choose the color that you might want to deal with. Now, I would actually love to see an interesting application of this filter. I've aside from very subtle effects, I've never actually been able to use this vignette filter terribly successfully, and it probably just pertains to the kind of imagery that I'm making and the way that I do my post-processing. But if you have any interesting applications of this filter, or really any of the filters, oops, I don't want the vignette filter, I'm going to get rid of it. I would love to see those. So if you use Facebook or if you're on Instagram, you can find me on both of those social media outlets. My Instagram handle is Daniel Alden. So it's just DANIEL ALDEN. And then on Facebook, it's just my name, Daniel Alden Hughes. You can find me that way. And I'd love to see what everybody's doing with these kinds of applications as well, especially if you find a really great application of the vignette filter itself. So you could kind of take that as a challenge or not, whatever. But I'd love to see what you guys are up to. Now, the last filter that we're going to talk about, at least on this image, is the darken, lighten, center filter. And this is the sort of, if you will, vignette filter that I find myself using most often because it's kind of like magic. It lightens the center of the image, it darkens the edge of the image, but there's no kind of signature that you might see from one of those vignette filters, which again, they have their time and place and they're fantastic. I just find myself using the darken, lighten, center filter more often than any of the other vignette tools. And what this is trying to do is, again, direct the viewer's attention towards the subject or towards the center of the image. You can always place the center of the image in a different place. You can change the shape of your center. So you have either a circular center point or a more long oval center point. And then you can change the center luminosity. You can lighten or darken it. You can change the border luminosity, lighten or darken it. And then you can change the center size. So if you want the center to be really small, it's a very specific area, you can make that center size small. If you have a larger, more broad area that you want to control using this darken, lighten, center filter, you can make a larger center size. In this case, I'm going to make a smaller center size. I've already kind of shifted it downward in the direction of where the horse is moving. And then I don't need such a strong application of the filter. So I'm going to go ahead and actually, I like what it's doing with this really strong application of the center luminosity. Maybe it's too much at 100, but as we're looking at that, it kind of relights the photograph. In fact, we've used these more corrective filters, pro contrast, graduated neutral density, and darken, lighten, center, and we've pretty dramatically changed the image, which we have this overall kind of flat lighting initially. It's a good capture in terms of the shutter speed was fine, the depth of field works appropriately, but the lighting is a little bit flat in this case. And by using these three filters, I think we've really nicely sort of attracted the viewer's attention towards the subject a little bit more. And yet we've done it in a way that's very photographic looking and in a way that maybe a viewer wouldn't be able to tell we're actually doing these adjustments. And so the image looks better, but it doesn't necessarily look like it's been changed from its initial state. It looks like it could be reality. Anyways, I like processing in that way. So I'm going to click the OK button because I'm really happy with the effect. Actually, I'm not. I am happy with the effect, but I'm not going to click the OK button because I want to show you one more thing while we're in here, because let's say we really love this stack of filters, or let's say we are equine photographers, or we've gone to this event and we want to get a similar look and effect on 200 photographs or on 10 or however many images we want to apply this same stack of filters. To save this recipe, you click the Save Recipe button. That's underneath your filter stack on the right side. And then you just name it. So I might name this Thermal Corrective Preset. So I know my event. So it was the thermal race event, or not race, I'm sorry, thermal hunter jumper event at the time. And then this is a corrective preset. So I'll click the OK button, or maybe recipe, or I don't even need to add that last word. Click the OK button, and then it's going to add that recipe into my custom recipes section. So now I've added that last recipe that we've created. And that's how you do that. And this is a really nice, easy way of creating a good effect that you can use over and over and over again. Okay, so I just realized that I've used an entire hour talking. So I wanted to get into one more picture, but we've covered a lot of stuff in the webinar, and I want to move into a Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box. I just see one question right now. Could I have copied the control points from one filter to another? Absolutely. Great question, Edwin. There are a lot of sort of features that we weren't able to cover in the interface during the webinar. Hopefully we covered enough that was helpful for you, that were new. Why don't I show you how to copy control points from one filter to another filter? So we'll do that by opening up this image into Color Efex Pro. I'm going to click on a custom recipe just so we get something, so I don't have to, oh, I could have just used one of those. Let's see what would happen with one of these sort of fun, really weird recipes that I've created for different effects. Look at this one. This is crazy. Under the La Jolla Pier is what this one's called. Highly, highly transformative. Let's minimize that, the recipe set. I'm going to move the GoToWebinar control panel. We can actually see what each individual filter is doing by turning each one on or off. Okay, detail extractor is fine. Contrast color range, that looks good. Graduated neutral density, that's lightening the bottom portion of the image. I don't know if I need that one, so I'll get rid of it. Film effects vintage, that's highly transformative, and polarization, kind of making a little bit more pop happen in the image. So let's say we wanted to go in and remove this film effects vintage filter from certain areas, and then we wanted to copy those control points into another photograph. I'm actually going to leave the color in the clouds because that's a believable color in the clouds. I'm going to remove it from the trees, and then let's actually just place another minus control point down here, and one more minus control point for the sake of having multiple control points. So let's say we have these 3 control points, and when we want to copy them and add them to another one of our filters. What we need to do is actually make sure that they're on or activated. So you do that by clicking on them. And actually, I can only activate one at a time if I just click on it. If I click and drag around all of the control points, this is going to allow us to activate all of the control points that fall within that bounding box. So click and drag, it's going to create this sort of bounding box around anything that you encompass around it. Let go of the mouse, and that's going to turn on or activate all of those control points. And then what we would do to copy the control points so that we can paste them into a different filter is move to that little filter, or sorry, the stack. So we're in Film Effects Vintage, click on that little stack, and I want to say copy control points. Once I click copy control points, I can then move into maybe the detail extractor filter or any filter within our stack. Click on the little, geez, I'm going to call that a hamburger because that's what Hasselblad calls it on their menu system. But this little sort of like drop-down button, I can't think of a term for it. I click on that and I say paste control points, and any control points that I've copied are then going to be pasted into that image. So now I've removed the detail extraction from the trees in the background, whatever this control point was selecting, and then whatever this control point was selecting. So we look at the before and after. Here's the before, here's the after. It's kind of an interesting effect, and we were using a recipe that was really highly transformative. I love doing that as well, right? Because there's the potential of these things, but oftentimes those recipes need to be sort of wrangled in, or sometimes they need to be expanded upon as well. Maybe we need to be more transformative depending upon the application. All right, let's see. Are there any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? If not, we'll go ahead and hit the road here. I want to thank everybody for coming out to the webinar this afternoon. I'm here in New York, so it's just afternoon. I got Joe in New York and a couple other folks who stuck around for the questions and answers, so I greatly appreciate that. Have a wonderful day. Feel free to reach out, and I'd love to see you again at other webinars. So thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen.